Hi, in this part 5 of this series, we are going to consume the Odata service that we have created in the previous step. So in the previous step, what we did is that we have just created a simple Odata service with which we are exposing the information about this sales order. So we have only implemented for this sales order set, sales order entity set where we are going to display the list of sales order. So we are just going to consume that and we are going to display that information in this master page over here. So to do that, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to construct a OData model which is going to consume that service from the backend, and it is going to provide this data to this master view. So to do that, what I will do is first thing I'm going to enable this service. So what I will do is that I'm going to introduce one more section over here, which I'm going to call it as a service configuration, where I'm going to specify that the service configuration as config. Inside this config section, I'm going to specify what is the message bundle where I wanted to get the URL for this message bundle. So right now I do not implement that. Then I'm just going to specify this service URL where I'm going to specify the service config where I'm going to specify this service URL where the name of the URL is this and the service URL is going to be this. So here in the place of service URL, I'm just going to give this service URL which is generated. So while we are implementing our application, while we're deploying our application in the gateway service, it is sufficient that I only specify this path. I do not have to specify the complete path like this. As my UEFI application also will be running on the same host, I do not have to specify this complete path. So only this path is needed for me to identify the service, which I will specify it over here. So this is the service URL which I'm going to consume in order to create my OData model. So in order to create this OData model, we need this class for this OData model, which I'm going to import here as SAP slash UI slash model slash OData slash version 2 slash OData model. So I'm just going to use this version 2 API over here, and this I'm going to import into my method as OData model. So I have loaded this resource and I have imported it over here. Then what I'm going to do is that in the onInt function, I'm going to get the service URL and instantiate my model. So to get the service URL, the service URL is something that I have placed in the config section. So I'm just going to get it as variable um, yes service URL is equal to this dot get metadata of get config. So in the metadata section, it gets me this config section, and in the config section, I know that this is the object service config, and inside the service config object, I know that this is the attribute which contains the URL. So I got the service URL over here. So based upon the service URL, I'm going to construct my OData model. So to construct this OData model, I'm going to say that variable O model is equal to new. I have imported the short name OData model. So I'm just using the short name, and I'm going to specify the service URL where I'm going to specify the service URL here. And the next parameter that I'm going to pass over here is in the M parameters. What I'm basically going to do is that I'm just going to specify this JSON format as true so that the payload will be in JSON format. So it says that a request true to be the payload will be in JSON. So I'm just going to set the second parameter as true. So I specified this, and then what I'm going to do is that I'm going to set this model in the component level so that this model will be available throughout my entire application. And I set this model as a base model for my application. So this is going to be the default model. Now that I have created the instance of this model, what I will do is that this model instance will be available to me inside this master view. So inside this master view, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a list control where for this list control, I'm going to provide the ID as ID sales order, and let's say ID sales order list. And inside the sales order list, I'm going to specify this items aggregation. And before that, for this items aggregation, I'm going to specify the binding where I'm going to specify this items aggregation with the binding information. And I would wanted it to be binded to. So I haven't actually implemented for this, so I'll just put it to HTTP. Okay, so this is the entity for which I wanted to display the value. So usually we will put this entity as a slash. So I take this particular path and I tell the system that in whatever the service you are executing, I'm just adding this path slash sales order set to indicate that it has to get the data for this. So this will give me the array of value over here. So this will give me the array of value over here, which I'm going to display it by looping the values one after another inside the template. So inside the template, I am going to make use of this object list item as a template where I'm going to specify the type to be active, and I'm going to specify this title as, let's say I wanted to display this sales order ID. So I'll just display the sales order ID as a title. Then I'm going to specify this number, where the number I'm going to get it from this gross amount field. So I'll just put it over here, and I'm going to specify this number unit, where number unit is something that I'm going to get it from the currency code. So I'll just bind it to this. Then I'm going to specify some of the other properties, such as um, I'm going to specify the attributes, where in the attributes I'm going to specify this buyer ID and buyer name. So I'm going to give this buyer ID over here as object attribute, which has this text property, to which I specify the buyer ID as, sorry, buyer ID. And in a similar way, I'm going to define this buyer name, where I'm going to give the buyer name as another object attribute. Where I'm going to put this buyer name here. Then I'm going to introduce this sections called status, where it is first status. And inside the status, I'm going to define this first status with lifecycle status 1. So object status, where I'm going to specify this text coming from this lifecycle status field. Now, for this type of complex binding to work, I'm going to go to my index.html page, and I'm going to set this binding syntax to complex. So data hyphen sap hyphen ui hyphen xx hyphen binding syntax is equal to complex binding syntax. That is what I wanted to use for this application. So in the master view, I just created a list control which takes the value from the sales order set entity set, and for each and every row I'm just looping it and I'm performing this relative binding over here. So now my model has been instantiated and it has been executed. The next thing what I'm going to do is that I'm going to deploy this project. The reason why I wanted to deploy this project is that earlier when you saw here, my application was running in this particular host, where this is the location where my UI5 application is executing. And if you check the service URL for this, it is getting executed in this particular host. So this is my service. Now, when I'm trying to communicate, when I execute my UEFI application, I'm trying to communicate from this particular host location to this particular host location. So when this host is different, system, the browser, it basically makes this checks called CSRF, which is cross-site request forgery, which means that it does not allow an application from one particular host to communicate with another particular host without proper authentication, so as to prevent your data. So since it does not allow this service to execute, since it does not allow this application to execute this one, what I will do is that I will also I will also deploy this application in the same server, so that the URL will get same. So the URL will be same. So the UEFI application and the gateway service runs on the same host so that it will be able to communicate with this particular data. So to deploy this application, what I will do is I'll just right click on it and I will say team share project, and I'm going to share it as a SAP UEFI ABAP repository. Where I click on next, it asks me in which server you wanted to deploy this, and I click on next and I specify the password. Click on next, and here I'm going to say that I wanted to be deployed as a new application, and I wanted to put it in a local object. I click on next and finish. So now what it will does is that in that particular name, whatever I have provided, it will create me a application. So one problematic thing that I have over here is that the gateway, sorry, the SAP UEFI version that I have in the Eclipse is 1.40, and whatever the UEFI version that I have in the server where I have deployed is 1.34. So what I will do is that since I cannot upgrade this UEFI version in my server, I'm going to make use of this UEFI library which is available here, which is resources slash sap.ui.co.js, which will contain the latest version. So I'm going to go over here, and in the index.html page, I'm just going to redirect this path to that of this web path. So I get the latest library and I will execute my application. So here, once I have deployed my application, you can see this arrow mark, arrowhead indicating that these are the files that are about to be inserted and it has not been committed yet. So I'll say team submit, with which it is going to indicate me that these are the files which are going to be created newly into my server. So I'll say finish and I'm going to deploy this one. Alternatively, there is also a report with which you can upload the UEFI application. So for this approach to work, we needed some special parameters set in our user. If that is not available, then we have to go with our alternate approach. So that is something that I have explained in one of the previous session. So we have deployed our application in this particular server, and I'm just going to run my application from this server. I'm just going to say run on server, and this is going to give me the URL. And here, one minor change that I'm going to do is that the way that I have configured my server, I have configured it in my local host. So I will run it from my local host, and my application will get executed over here, and it will display this information. So in your case, you do not have to modify this host name, whereas here the server that I'm using is something that I have locally installed in my machine. So I have just configured it in localhost. So I'm just using this localhost URL. So now you could see that the information that I have specified here is being retrieved from this service, and it has been displayed over here in this object list item. So before we see more detailed information about this in the detail section, there are certain actions that I'm going to do it from the perspective of the um, master screen, like filtering, sorting, and so on. So we will parallelly implement that both from the UI as well as at the level of the backend, and we will complete this part from the master section. Then we will move on to our detailed screen. So in the next session, what I will be doing is that I'll be implementing the logic for your filtering and the refresh logic. So that is what I'm going to do it in the next session. So see you then. Thanks for watching.